Today, we are covering APIs and a front end. The challenge will be picking up where you all left off the other day with a back-end Python script, and the exercise will be going over Bootstrap and a JSON placeholder API. So earlier this week, you used Fetch API. You also created an application using free APIs. Let's take a moment to consider what an API is at its simplest form. API stands for an Application Programming Interface, and it is a collection of communication protocols and subroutines. Even simpler, it's like an interpreter between you and a third party. So let's say, for example, a waiter interprets your order and relays it to the chef. The waiter then returns your order. Similarly, an API interprets your input and relays it to a server backend system, which then returns a request. For today's exercise and the challenge, we're basically creating a front end. It's going to be user interactive, and it will communicate with the back end utilizing APIs. Like you've seen so far, we'll be using very basic components of an HTML document, JavaScript code, and CSS style sheets. We'll also be exploring Bootstrap, which is a library for styling, and I will demonstrate a few different APIs and run through a visual demonstration of what today's exercise will look like, and then you all will jump in and do the exercise on your own. So Bootstrap, it's basically a very easy to use library with lots of documentation. It's imported into an HTML document, just like a typical CSS file. You can override styling for a style sheet that you import from Bootstrap, but really you could override styling that you set anywhere with styling defined later on in the code. There are also different ways to call styling. You could call it through a CSS file, or you could define it within a style block inside your code, or you could define it directly inside the element. This is an example of importing both a Bootstrap style sheet and your own style sheet, a local style sheet. So here we have a URL pointing to Bootstrap and a local file. Any properties in this local file will override the properties in the style sheet. Internal CSS looks just like this. You're basically creating a style element, and you're defining your CSS style within that code block. And you could do this directly in the HTML document that you wish to create the styling in. And finally, you can style directly inside of an element. For example, here we have a paragraph block with a statement, and the statement will be styled to be the color blue and size 46, regardless of what styling was defined previously. I will share, actually, this URL should be available from the README. If not, I'll share it in the group chat. But basically, this is where you're going to go to see all the different Bootstrap subclasses and how they work. For example, if we were going to navbar, we see some documentation telling us that this navbar requires a wrapping, which is then called with this string right here. Similarly, for a nav, we just use the base.nav class to call it. So the documentation is very simple, it's straight to the point, and it is available from this link. So for today's exercise, again, we are going to be using JavaScript to create the the functionality for the front end. And we are going to be creating variables for URLs, for containers, and we'll be writing functions for event listeners, API requests, and subroutines. Within the DOM, as we discussed last week, there are different elements and objects. A document is the global context for any browser-loaded HTML document. It has a method called query selector, which allows you to select an element by passing in a string. There are also event objects, which signal the occurrence of an event, which is triggerable by a user clicking on a button, for example, or a browser being run through some code. The target is a read-only property of the event, and this target can be used to pull an element that the event is targeting. An element is basically a base class for all objects within a DOM, and it has built-in functions such as the add event listener. You attach an event listener to an element, and essentially when that event occurs, then another method is called. Similarly, you could use onClick on an existing element, and when that element is clicked on, it returns the function of an event. This on function is actually applicable to a variety of different elements. There should be a list, I'll share that list with you later on, of all the different things you can. Yeah, here it is. Actually, let's take a look at this right now. So DOM events, there is a click event, for example, and if you use the onClick function, it will call a function that it's attached to. You could use on with virtually any of these events. So really, there are two ways of calling back a callback function through an event, and that would be A, using an event listener, and B, using the on element method. So document query selector. This is the internal method to the document object that allows you to select any element within the DOM. This is a very simple method. It just takes in a string, and you could pass it three different variations of that string. If you pass it just the string alone, it will return the first element of that type. So if we were to run document.querySelector and pass in h1, it will find the first h1 element in the document. You can, let's say you have multiple h1 elements. You have multiple headers with multiple lines. If you wanted to pull a particular one, you could assign it a class. And then you could use query selector with a period-led string. And that will return the first element where that class is defined. Similarly, with a hash, you can return the first element with this ID. So three ways to pull elements using this method, all in some shape or form are through a string parameter. The basic flow of the user interaction, they will hit a button on the front end, which will trigger the event listener, which calls a callback function, which then updates the browser element. And again, I will share this link in Slack. I'll demo the exercise first, and then I will have you all run through the exercise. I'm going to have you all pair up today. So I think we have an odd number. There will be one group of three then, but basically I would like two of the groups to volunteer to demonstrate the exercise, and then the remaining two groups that didn't volunteer will demonstrate the challenge later on this evening, which is the front end for the HTTP server that you started yesterday. I have added some additional stretch goals to both the exercise and the challenge because I know a few of you like to work ahead. So for the exercise, stretch goals include updating the draw user to retrieve a single user as opposed to an entire list. Another stretch goal will be to split the functionality of this function from toggling between draw user and remove user. And then I'd like you to limit that viewable list to 4 users and incorporate one of the free image APIs to give the user an avatar. I will share this in Slack later on. Stretch goals for the challenge will be to create a 4th endpoint that accepts user input data. This data should be received by the HTTP backend and written into a CSV file. A 5th endpoint will then delete that CSV data, and the front end will be updated to display the CSV data so you can see it record and delete user input live. All right, so let's switch over to VS Code. Thank you, Tiffany. And let's take a look at what some of this code looks like. Is this right? This looks like it's right. Cool. Let me know again if this text is too small. I will enlarge it once. Here, actually, I might want to share the entire screen because I'm going to have to toggle back to the browser to show this code live. So sorry about that. Let me switch to this. Much better. So we will have, like I mentioned earlier, an index, an app.js, and a style sheet. The index will allow you to import a Bootstrap style sheet, which is what is happening here. There are these extra parameters, but all of that will be available from the Bootstrap website. It's as simple as copy and paste. And then here I have a second style sheet defined. It's, as of right now, an empty style sheet. But again, if I were to write any properties into this style sheet, I could use that to overwrite any properties, any styling that I don't like from the bootstrapped CSS sheet. Going down a bit, we have another way of overriding styling. And again, that is through an internal style block. The style element allows you to define CSS the way that you would in a CSS file. And because it's loaded after these previous sheets, it will override any property in the first 2 sheets. And finally, when we go down to inline styling, I'd have an example of that. I thought I had an example of that. I might have deleted it. But inline styling, again, is basically style that is created within an element. So let's take a look at what is happening right now. Pulling up live server. Let me make sure you're all seeing this. You are seeing the browser, right?
Before you get too much further, can you let Harry in if you haven't yet?
All right, on, sure.
Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. I think what I'll do also next week, Tiffany, is once I start, I'll promote you to host so you can let anyone in that needs to be let in. Because I don't see where that is right now. I don't know if I see the request. Oh, there we go. He might have exited. But Harry, I believe he's joining right now. Okay. So this is an example of what the front end will look like. I am using a style sheet from Bootstrap, and I have a few buttons created here that will trigger the free doc API and a free image API. I have them set to load images into the same container. And what's happening behind the scenes is the button calls an event listener, which then calls the callback function, which then updates the front end. And for the exercise, we are going to be retrieving users. And at first, you'll be retrieving an entire list of users. But again, one of the stretch goals will be to update that function so that you're returning only one user at a time. Right now, I have it set up to pull a random user. That's an option. You could also just have it iterate through the list and pull one user at a time. However you'd like to do that, it's up to you. And let's go back to the code. Let's see what's happening here. Going into our app.js file, we can see that we have some parameters set in the very beginning. We have URLs for each of the APIs. This is the API to the dog URL, this for the image URL, and this URL basically consists of an endpoint, the URL, with a question mark, and anything passing that question mark would be a property that you can pass in. So for example, we're passing in a format equals JSON property so that we retrieve the results as a JSON. Next, we have a container for the image and another variable for a URL for the image source. And we have a state that toggles based on whether or not users are loaded. And then we have the add button listener. And this listener has a few different functions, or actually a few, what should I call this? A few different variables that are assigned to the document.query selector method, and we are passing in a string. If we go back to the index, you can see that because we are using a hash symbol, we are returning an element with this ID. I have multiple buttons here. They're all nav buttons, but they have different IDs. And this is how I'm able to differentiate between these three different buttons for these three different variables. The two variables for the dog API and image API are very simple. They really just call the API, which is defined down here. What happens when that is called? Oh, let me actually backtrack a bit. So this is the query selector. This selects the query, and then within this, we have the onClick method. This is essentially how we are registering the event and calling the callback function. Request image API, request dog API, these are the callback functions. So those functions are defined down here, and what happens when they are called is, first, they are asynchronous functions, which means that the resulting code can occur without having to wait for this response. This can all happen asynchronously to the code existing prior. Now we have, let me find where I was. Some variables defined here. We have result awaiting the fetch of the dog API URL. So basically this fetch is making a request to this API endpoint, and we are awaiting that response. We assign that response to the result object, and then we create a new variable called JSON, where we use another await to convert the result to JSON. So this await is important. It allows us to wait for a response before the rest of the code runs, because otherwise it will error out. Next, we have another parameter source, which is equal to the message, because if we were to look at this response, we will see that the JSON has a property called message. So let's go back here. Let's go into our little panel here. And when I click on Dog API, we can see the JSON response. And it is a very small JSON file, but it has a key message, and the value is the URL to the image. So from there, we call another function at the end of this function, which is basically a subroutine. And what this subroutine does is it updates the image container with a new URL. So let's look at that function. It takes in a source and it sets that source to be the source of the image container being this in the HTML, this element right here. So once that is updated, the image is updated on your screen, and we can see in console a message saying that the image has been updated. Finally, we have the same thing basically for the random image API, but we also have the API for today's exercise, which is the user API. And I'll run through it really quick, but really you'll be creating these in pairs yourselves. It similarly to the image APIs calls, it consists of a query selector selecting an element being the button inside the HTML document. We pass it a string to do that, and then it uses the onClick to pay attention for the click event. And from there, it has conditional to check whether users are already loaded. If they are not, then we call the draw users function. If they are, then we call remove users. One of the stretch goals, again, is to split this functionality up into two different buttons. But for now, what's happening is, as you can see here, the text changes. When we have a user, we have the option of removing the user. And when we have no user to remove, we have the option of retrieving a user. The callback functions in this case would be draw users and remove users. And that code is down here. This is going to be very similar to the code that you see inside today's exercise. Any questions so far? Cool. Then I'll jump straight into it. I will create breakout rooms, and I will have Zoom pair you all up. And again, we will reconvene at what time is it now? It is 6 o'clock, and we are going to reconvene at about 6:30 to review the exercise, unless, of course, you all need more time. If you need more time, just let me know, and we will give you more time. But for now, we will jump into the exercise and meet back at 6:30 for reviewing the results. Any questions? Cool. Let me make these breakout rooms.